Should you work at an architecture firm that covers residential design, or should you work at one that does commercial? The answer really depends on where you're at in your career. Are you just starting out? Are you in school and you're thinking about this for when you graduate? Or are you working right now at a specific type of firm, for example, commercial, and you're thinking of switching over to residential? In this video, I want to cover what are the key differences between residential and commercial, and if one should appeal more to you depending on where you are in your career. Now, when I first started, I got into commercial architecture. When I got into architecture in general, I wanted to do residential. Residential is the reason why I got into architecture, because residential is the most relatable to me. It still is to this day. I live in a home, even though I visit commercial projects every single day, whether it's a mall that I'm going to or Starbucks to get coffee. The home is the one that I relate to the most because I live in one and I spend so much time in one. That is what I relate to, and that's always what's called my attention in architecture. The reason I started in commercial is because it's easier to find a job in commercial architecture most of the time. If you look around you, there's usually a lot of commercial projects being done, and the residential projects that are being done around you, usually speaking, generally speaking, are either renovations or they're cookie cutter developments. The more non-cookie cutter stuff tends to be the commercial projects. So there's more commercial, and to add to that, commercial projects tend to make more money. They're more lucrative for developers. They're more attractive, right? So if you're just starting out, you should probably look into getting a commercial project. And even if, or a commercial firm as your first firm, and even if you're thinking that you want to do residential, you should still understand what commercial firms are like, how they run, what they spend most of their time on, and I'm gonna cover that a little bit in this video. But the reason why is, hopefully your goal one day is to get licensed. And if you want to get licensed in the United States, your exams are going to focus on the commercial side of architecture. It's going to focus on things like ADA. And although in residential, you sometimes deal with fair housing, where you have to have certain spaces designed specifically, ADA is what governs commercial projects. And it's going to be important to understand that for the test, as well as typical construction detailing. Most of these tests, or the great majority of these tests, cover commercial architecture. So you having an understanding in commercial architecture is going to speed up the chances, or speed up the time that it's going to take you to get licensed as an architect. So if you're just starting out, even if you want to do residential, I think it's worth spending a few years in a commercial practice or in a commercial setting to get that experience under your belt. Now, I want to make another video where I cover what kind of things you should be on the lookout for, like a treasure hunt of some sort, so that when you're working at a commercial firm, what kind of questions should you be asking? What kind of things, information should you be gathering? Putting it in your little toolbox that can help you in your career before you leave that commercial firm. Now, another big group of you guys are probably working at a firm right now and are thinking of switching to the other. And so this is a part of the video where I want to talk about the key differences between each type of firm. Now, as I mentioned, when I first started architecture, I was doing a lot of commercial. I was doing things like higher education. I was doing things like aviation and just miscellaneous commercial projects, right? There's key differences between each of these typologies, but very generally speaking, the experience at an architecture firm that does commercial versus one that does residential is almost completely different night and day. And it all goes down to who the client is. When you're doing commercial projects, most of the time, the client is not one person, but an entity. They tend to be developers, and their goal is to maximize profit. They don't really care. And again, guys, I'm generalizing here. So if you're a developer that gets your feelings hurt by what I'm saying, that's not my goal. But generally speaking, their goal is to maximize profit. So what does this mean? When you're maximizing profit, if that's your priority, you don't really care about how your building fits into the urban fabric. You're mostly concerned with value engineering. You're going to hear that word thrown out a lot in commercial projects. You're also going to be working on certain elements that you would not be working on when you're working at a residential firm. For example, parking garages or parking in general. Things like a parking stall, how much parking is required, how much of that should be ADA, are there any setbacks required in the parking, where can you put cars and where can you not, how do you enter the building, things like curb cuts for ADA and for public access, things like traffic studies. These are just things that you don't concern yourself with when you're working at a residential firm. Moving into the building, right? Putting like the assemblies aside, because the way you build commercial projects is not really the way that you build homes. I mean, you certainly can, but typically you don't. And it depends also what climate zone you are, so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the assemblies are very different in commercial. The finishes inside of commercial buildings, generally speaking, are different than the ones that you would find in residences. I used to work a lot on, so after I was doing like higher ed and aviation and um, like medical institutions, I moved into like a happy medium between that and single family residential, and that was commercial. Commercial like high rises that deal with like hotels, hospitality basically. And I started to do like multifamily buildings. And the differences was that even though it is homes like condos for people, it really relates to the way that you are still doing commercial design, whereas you're still worried about things like life safety. And I mean life safety, like the technical life safety, like how are you getting people out of here and dead zones, dead end zones and things like that. I'm not talking about, keeping people safe, right? Keeping people's lives safe. That's the primary concern in any type of architecture. But it's something that you actually have to do studies for when you're doing commercial. It's more strict than if you're doing residential. You're focusing on things like elevators, types of elevators. How do people access the elevators? How do they access the floors that they're on? You're thinking about the cores a lot, stair cores, detailing the stairs, keeping in mind, accessibility throughout. And you're not really concerned with the finishes in the sense that, yes, you want your building to look nice, but generally speaking, I throw that word a lot because I know if I don't, people are going to complain. But generally speaking, it's very generic interiors, right? Finishes are pretty much on the lobby, like the really high-end stuff, and everything else goes as cookie cutter as possible. So when you're dealing with commercial, to basically summarize that up, your concern is mostly how do I cater to this big group of people all at once? You're not thinking of the individual, right? Now, this is real world. If we were talking about like how should architecture be, and if you guys want to open up your own firms one day, your own commercial firms one day, definitely the end user should be the person that you're thinking of, each individual person, how each individual person handles their experience or deals with this building. That should be your goal, to make that experience as seamless and as enjoyable as possible, obviously safety being the primary concern. But unfortunately, when you're working at commercial firms, it's about generating construction documentation for building buildings that just meet a specific need pretty efficiently and value engineered to hell, so that the developer could maximize on profits. It is what it is, guys. I'm not pointing any fingers here. If I was a developer, I'd probably be doing the same thing. I mean, hopefully, uh, the goal would be that I'm not value engineering the hell out of it to maximize profits as much as I could. But hopefully, I'd be able to redesign some of these spaces to give back to the community or give back to the users. You know, it doesn't always have to be as black and white as I'm describing it. But that's the idea at the end of the day. When you summarize what construction or what commercial architecture is like, you're basically trying to make the developer happy, zoning happy. So you're just trying to maximize on that building envelope, trying to use up every single last square inch of that building envelope as possible to achieve more rentable space, more usable space. But everything else is pretty generic, you know, especially if you're working like on office buildings. You're not really concerned with furnitures. You're concerned with like vertical access, horizontal egress, daylighting, coordinating with your engineers. And that's basically the gist of commercial architecture. Now, I worked on a lot of cool commercial projects that had really cool um, consultants. Like I worked one time with a landscaping firm that just designed the freaking coolest poolside area for this multi-family condo building. It was just beautiful. It was like I haven't visited that project yet, and so I don't know what the experience is like. But man, the renderings and the sketches, they were beautiful, and this firm was very talented. But that's the idea behind commercial. Now, when you're talking about residential architecture, everything kind of completely changes, because now you're concerned, and I'm talking about single family here, right? But now you're concerned with the actual end user. Chances are that the end user is your client. Now, I've been lucky enough to work on projects as cheap as like $200,000 to $300,000 to multi-million-dollar single family homes. And it gets pretty ridiculous, guys, at that level. But something that I want you to think about is, when you're doing commercial spaces, everything's pretty generic. But when you're doing residential spaces, you are in charge of every single part of that building. I mean, let's just think about the roof. When you're doing commercial, chances are you're doing a parapet wall. It's a flat roof, mechanical equipment is on the roof. You have a parapet wall that goes all around, you have some scuppers, and that's it. You're calling it a day. Pretty generic detail. But when you're thinking about a single family home, that roof is probably not one single volume. That house probably has multiple roofs with multiple pitches, multiple overhangs. The way that the gutter sits at every overhang is probably different. You probably need a detail for each one of those. Probably have a flat portion over the garage, let's say with a parapet. It's not common, but you could have that. The garage door is probably unique. Probably have to detail that out. You're making schedules for every single door and window in the project. And there's a lot of changes, guys. In commercial architecture, the changes are usually warranted by value engineering. Now, that does happen in residential architecture too, but most of the time in residential architecture, changes come directly from the client. They start to see some sketches that you do or some renderings that you do. They're like, you know what, I'm not liking this anymore. Or you know what, I went to a friend's house last week and they showed me that they did this in their house. I want that in my house. Or, I was watching HGTV and scrolling on Pinterest simultaneously, and I came up with this idea in my head, and I want to do this. And it really depends on the client and how much money they have. As I said, I've worked on houses from multiple budget sizes. And on the shallower budget size, you still have changes, but it's more toward, I've realized that I want to save a little bit of money, but I want to put more money on the kitchen. Whereas on the higher end side of the budget, when clients are very wealthy, they're like, I just want to redesign the whole thing. I don't want it anymore. They'll redesign a powder room 40 times. Not kidding. This is true. So when you're thinking about residential architecture and you're thinking about every single space inside of a home, right? Every single room and every single function that a room has, you're in charge of detailing every single room. You wouldn't design a wellness massage room the way that you would design a kitchen. You wouldn't design a powder room the way that you design a master bath. You wouldn't design a theater the way that you would design a family or a living room. So each of these rooms are unique. They all have different finishes. They all have different baseboards. Depending on the type of architecture that you're doing, you have different crown moldings at the top. You have wainscoting. It's just all this detail that goes away from being typical to more than likely being custom. Now, of course, if you're on the lower end side and you're just making a very simple single family home, there's obviously less involved. But arguably, when you compare it to like commercial, there's more involvement in decision making as to the aesthetics of each space of the home versus a commercial building. And you guessed it, generally speaking. So if you're thinking about switching from one to the other, guys, this is my advice. I always give advice to you guys the way that I would give advice to myself, right? If you're at the beginning of your career, whether you want residential or commercial, I would say start with commercial. If it's good always to get experience from both. So if you know you want to do commercial for the rest of your life, then it's interesting to think about starting in residential first. But like I said, if you're just getting your first job, your goal is probably getting licensed as soon as possible. Assuming you're young, you don't have a family yet, you want to get licensed as quick as possible before life takes over and blocks you or slows you down dramatically from being able to get your license. So if you are just starting out, I mean, ideally you would want both under your belt. But if you're just starting out, I want to say go for commercial first. Go for commercial first, do that for a few years, try to get your license, and then switch over to residential if that's your passion. And if that's not your passion, guys, you could always learn residential architecture from videos online. It's harder, in my opinion, to learn commercial stuff or to get the experience from commercial architecture from videos than it is to do residential. Now, if you have a completely different opinion than I do, I respect that and I welcome that. So let me know down in the comments and we'll discuss that. And if you are at a commercial or residential firm and you're thinking of switching to the other side, right? You already have the experience, you might have the license, or maybe you don't even care to get your license. You just want to switch. Then my advice to you is do it. As I mentioned before, I did commercial. I don't really have interest in working commercial ever again. After I opened up my own company, I started to get a few small, like mostly schematic design stuff for a few commercial projects. And I did pick them up and they were enjoyable. But I really don't have an interest in doing CDs anymore at a commercial project. But you never know, right? You never know what life throws at you. This moment in time, I'm really enjoying residential. There are a couple of things that I find easier in commercial, but I do really enjoy the challenges that residential architecture makes me face. As you all probably have heard me say, one of my biggest interests in the future, and not necessarily the near future, but it is becoming a developer myself. It's what I've been studying to do. It's what I've been little by little positioning myself strategically to be able to achieve. And hopefully, I'm able to achieve that sooner than later. But as I see it, commercial tends to be more lucrative. And it almost is like you want to do a few commercial projects to get that kind of money. And then you can sit back and do some single family homes, you know? But we'll see. We'll see what happens when we get there. But that being said, I do think that you should do whatever makes you the most happy, because when I was working in commercial, I was like borderline miserable. And I hear that a lot from a lot of guys that are out there saying like architecture is not for me, architecture is not for me. It's that's not the truth, guys. I think that it's A, your firm is not for you, and B, your project types are not for you. It's not architecture. Architecture is very broad, guys. So if you're unhappy where you are and you're just curious about the other side, I would say go for it. Go for it, because I did that and I'm truly so much happier, and I feel way more successful now than I ever did back then. So, with all that being said, I want to wish you guys luck on all your architecture and whatever other endeavors you may have. Till next time, peace out.